delighted to introduce Dr. Dan Denis from the Department of Psychology here at York. Dan's research is broadly in the area of sleep and its impact on cognition, mental health, and wakefulness generally. But he also has an interest in sleep paralysis. Now, many of you will know a thing or two about sleep paralysis experiences. It's when you are drifting off to sleep or coming out of sleep, and you attain consciousness, but the body doesn't move. Often these experiences are associated with a whole range of really unpleasant features. There might be a sense of a presence in the room, and not a benign one. There might be a sense that a spiritual entity is causing the paralysis, and often these are called supernatural entity attack experiences. They're found in all parts of history and in all cultures across the world. What Dan is going to do today is provide an overview of the cultural historical context, but also then show how the tools of science can help us understand these experiences better and hopefully make them less frightening for the people who have them. So, thank you, and over to you, Dan.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many people coming out on a Sunday evening to come and listen to some science. So I always like to start these talks with a little survey. So of the people here, you can put your hand up if you've ever had an experience similar to what Robin described. You've woken up in the middle of the night and you find yourself completely paralyzed and unable to move. How many people here have had that sort of experience? Okay, some of you have. Oh, come in. Yeah, no worries. So for those of you that have had these experiences before, hopefully this evening's talk will give you a little bit more insight into what those experiences may have been. For those of you who haven't ever had this sort of experience before, I find that explaining what sleep paralysis is and how it can develop and affect people can be really quite stark. And I think the best way to introduce the topic really is to show a short film that can really drive home the emotional intensity and the bizarreness and the terrifyingness of sleep paralysis experiences. And it can do it a lot better than I can by just talking to you. This was a film that I had the pleasure of working on about 10 years ago now. This is a short experimental film. It's just an 8-minute documentary by Carla MacKinnon was the director, and she had frequent sleep paralysis experiences and kind of put her own experiences into this film. So we're going to start by watching the film. It's just 8 minutes long, and then we'll go into some discussion. So I like to show that film first because it really shows very clearly how you can have this experience. On the one hand, is also interpreted in very supernatural terms, and you have all of these strange things coming to visit you when you're sleeping, like demons and monsters and ghosts and spirits and that kind of thing. But at the same time, this comes across as extremely real. It's sort of hyper-realistic, so it's no wonder that many people ascribe supernatural interpretations when they have these kinds of experiences. It's also captured the imaginations of artists and writers and musicians for hundreds of years. This is probably the most famous depiction of sleep paralysis. This is Henry Fuseli's painting called The Nightmare from 1781. And in it, it really depicts kind of the prototypical sleep paralysis experience. You've got these kinds of nightmarish creatures kind of just out of sight. You've got this sort of demonic entity sitting on top of the sleeper's chest, crushing them down. A feeling of weight on the chest and pressure and suffocation is so common in sleep paralysis, and often can be believed to be caused by these sorts of demonic entities that are coming to you and crushing you. In the picture, the sleeper here, she's lying on her back. Almost all sleep paralysis episodes happen when you're lying on your back. It's so often the case that you're on your back that we actually recommend to people who suffer from sleep paralysis a lot to try to do something like sewing something uncomfortable into your pajamas or something so that you don't roll onto your back, because it seems a lot more likely to happen when you're lying on your back. Although if you sleep like this, you are just asking for trouble, I think. It's not called for. Even the name of the painting, The Nightmare, is an interesting one. These days we think of a nightmare more in terms of like a bad dream or something. But back in Fuseli's time, a nightmare was used to describe something much more similar to what we would consider to be sleep paralysis today. A physical nocturnal assault by a demon or some other evil spirit that causes you to be paralyzed and unable to move. So this creature that's sat on her chest here is a depiction of something called an incubus demon, and these are kind of some of the probably some of the clearest kind of folklore examples we have of something that's analogous to a sleep paralysis experience. Back in Fuseli's time and earlier, it was really taken as fact that these kinds of demons existed and interacted with humans. The general myth around an incubus demon is that it's this kind of sex-crazed demon that will come and nocturnally assault you. An incubus is a male demon that would attack a female sleeper, and the succubus is the opposite way around, so a female demon that would attack a male. But the idea is the same. And there's lots of reports from this era of these kinds of incubus attacks that all kind of follow this same narrative, that people wake up in bed, they can't move at all, and then they get assaulted and attacked by this demon where it tries to suffocate them. The level of belief people had in these kinds of demons is obviously far greater back then than it maybe is today. Indeed, books like the Malleus Maleficarum, which is on the right-hand here, this is kind of a very sort of an infamous book from the 15th century. It was kind of written as sort of a guide for witch hunting, essentially, how you can identify witches and that kind of thing. And in that book, there's lots of descriptions of these sleep paralysis-like experiences, and it's really just taken as fact that these sorts of demons existed and did this kind of thing. So it was mentioned in the film as well that a lot of sleep paralysis-like episodes have were interpreted in earlier times as actually being witchcraft related and caused by witches. There's a famous folklorist called David Hufford who's done a lot of work on sleep paralysis, and he actually went through some of the trial documents back from the Salem witch trials in the end of the 1600s, where he drew a lot of links between the kinds of evidence that was put forward in these trials as actually really ringing true of being actually not witchcraft at all, but instead being sleep paralysis experiences. So I'm just going to read out one of those examples now. So this is a testimony from John Londor. This was used in his actual trial testimony against Bridget Bishop. She was one of 19 women who was executed for witchcraft in the Salem witch trials. This is what he had to say in his testimony. In the dead of night, I felt a great weight upon my breasts, and awakening, looked, and it being bright moonlight, did clearly see Bridget Bishop, or her likeness, sitting upon my stomach. And putting my arms off the bed to free myself from that great oppression, she presently laid hold of my throat and almost choked me. And I had no strength or power in my hands to resist or help myself. So this, it carries lots of the same parts, right? There's the paralysis, there's the creature, or the witch in this case, sat upon their chest, the difficulty breathing, the feelings of suffocation, the oppression. Very much sounds like what we would today consider to be sleep paralysis. And there's all kinds of these examples in various myths and legends in different cultures. Another one that I think is quite interesting is the old hag phenomenon. The old hag is a folklore belief from parts of Canada, from Newfoundland, and in this part of the world, the experience of an old hag experience or being hagged is actually a term that's used to describe the sleep paralysis experience. This feeling of being overwhelmed with paralysis, being unable to move, and again, almost always occurring in the night when this thing will come and visit you. And it's not just in Western cultures. There's examples from all around the world, really from every corner of the earth, of this same experience being interpreted maybe in slightly different ways. In Japan, there's the phenomenon of kanashibari, and that translates roughly as being weighed down by chains. And again, people describe sort of evil spirits coming to wrap people up and bind them up in these chains, these sort of magical chains in the night. More recently, as was also alluded to in the film, the same core experience has sort of changed again in the kinds of interpretations that we have about it, and also the things that people actually see. And indeed, the alien abduction kind of narrative and description of abductees often has a lot of parallels again with sleep paralysis. One really kind of interesting thing that's come out of this is this kind of very famous survey that was done in the early 1990s by ufologist Bud Hopkins. And he was very, very interested in trying to figure out how many American citizens had been abducted by aliens. And he realized that you can't just ask people, have you been abducted by aliens? Because, of course, the aliens have wiped your memory. So instead, what he decided to do was ask people about certain, what he called indicator symptoms. So these are things, other experiences that you may have had and you may have some kind of vague memory of, that if you've had one or more of these experiences, that increases the likelihood that you've actually been abducted by aliens. And the very top rated indicator symptom that he had on his list was waking up in the night, being unable to move. And in fact, 20% of respondents to this survey that he put out endorsed having experienced this. That in his mind was as evidence of alien abduction, but today we really know that to be instead sleep paralysis. And in fact, that 20% is quite key, because it's pretty much the same as what we find when we do surveys today, when we try to find out how many people have had these sleep paralysis experiences. And so I could spend this entire talk just going through different examples of this kind of myth around the world. But suffice to say that it's really something that can be found in pretty much all folklore beliefs that we know about. Sharpless and Dogramsey did a very, very thorough kind of search of the literature, and they found over 100 different cultural terms for this sleep paralysis experience. Really, from every continent, every corner of the world, has this kind of idea of these kinds of nocturnal assaults by some sort of evil spirit that always involve waking up in the night, always involve this paralysis, and always involve that core experience of that sense of presence, that those hallucinations of spirits or supernatural entities, and that difficulty breathing and that feeling of suffocation. Just a couple examples here. In China, you have ghost oppression. My favorite example of all actually is the experience of Kokma, which is from St. Lucia in the Caribbean, where they interpret these experiences to be the ghosts of dead, unbaptized babies that come back in the night to strangle you. So although these experiences are mostly or very often portrayed and often are kind of associated with supernatural causes and interpretations, that's not always the case at all. In fact, many people that have sleep paralysis report seeing people they know in their sleep paralysis hallucinations, or other sort of more real-worldy like hallucinations. So one of the sort of most striking examples of that came from the work of Devon Hinton, who's an American psychologist, I believe. And he was studying post-traumatic stress disorder in refugees of the Cambodian Civil War. And what he found that a lot of these people had a lot of sleep problems associated with their trauma. But one thing that he noted quite frequently is that these refugees would have sleep paralysis, and during their sleep paralysis experiences, they would see hallucinations of Khmer Rouge soldiers bashing down the door, coming around their bed, trying to strangle them, trying to drag them out of bed. So a hugely traumatic experience that actually seems to be getting replayed during these sleep paralysis hallucinations. And the phenomena of trauma replay in nightmares is very, very common in PTSD. And as we'll see later on, what I think is happening there is that you're getting these this dreamlike state, this state of consciousness associated with dreams and nightmares sort of spilling over into the waking state. So pretty much for as long as there's been interest in sleep paralysis from a supernatural perspective, there's also been interest in sleep paralysis from the medical profession and doctors. Very often this guy is associated as maybe providing the first ever kind of medical account of sleep paralysis. This is Isbrand van Dijmer-Broek. Apologies for the mispronunciation. So yeah, he was a Dutch physician living in the 1600s who did many, many things. I think he was widely known for his anatomy. He also did some proto-epidemiology work on how plague was spreading in the Netherlands at the time. But he also is credited with having providing one of the first medical accounts of a sleep paralysis experience. And although in his time, like we've seen, many people were attributing this to supernatural causes, in his account, he is very much of the belief that these sleep paralysis episodes are caused by something biological in the brain or in the body. Interestingly, he also recommends in his very early case accounts for the people that are suffering from this sleep paralysis should also do that trick I told you earlier of not lying on your back, because it seems so much more likely to happen if you are sleeping on your back. An earlier account actually comes from the Persian Dr. Akawahani Bukhari, again apologies for the pronunciation, who was living in what is now modern-day Uzbekistan. He published many medical texts, one of which was called The Hidawite, and in that he describes a phenomena called caboose, which also translates roughly into this nightmare-like experience. And he also, again, thought that these sleep paralysis experiences, or caboose as he called them, had a natural origin. He believed it was due to some unhealthy rising of vapors from the stomach to the brain. He also had some interesting ideas about how to cure sleep paralysis. He was a big fan of bloodletting as a way to overcome your sleep paralysis episodes. Not something I'd recommend today, but he certainly thought that was the answer. Again, you can go back as really almost as far as we have medical records. This Paulus Argentia guy from 625 to 690 also had a very early account of what we now know to be sleep paralysis. All of this is to say that alongside this long history of supernatural explanations, invoking paranormal and spiritual-based explanations, there is also a relatively long history of doctors and medics being interested in this experience as well, and sort of coming up with their own ideas about what the causes and treatments of them may be. And I think that leads quite nicely into what I want to talk about in the second half of my talk, which, as Robin said, is more about trying to see what we understand about sleep paralysis today. So I'm a psychologist and a cognitive neuroscience. I'm interested in how people behave. I'm interested in what the brain is doing, and so we're going to go into a little bit of that now. So the first thing we can do is try to answer some of the easiest questions we possibly can, which even that actually turns out to be harder than it may seem. So the first question we can ask is, how common is sleep paralysis? How many people actually have these experiences? So when we do our surveys, we typically find roughly 1/3 of people would endorse yes to the question, have you ever woken up in the night and been unable to move? So sleep paralysis in its most basic form, so just that feeling of paralysis, but also recognizing that you're awake, around about 1/3 of people will have this about once in their life. Those numbers start to come down as you start to ask more questions. So like for people that maybe have these experiences multiple times a year or multiple times a month, that number might drop to maybe 10%. And then fewer still will then have the associated hallucinations. So the sense of presence, the feeling of weight on the chest, the multi-sensory hallucinations of creatures and beings in the room with you. That's maybe more about 5 or 10%. But it's actually even asking this most basic question comes with its own complications. We found before that if we just ask people how common is sleep paralysis without any other qualifier, we find far fewer people would endorse that than a more detailed description, like I just gave you. And then similarly, in some other cultures where a sleep paralysis folklore may be better known to people, it gets more complicated again. So we mentioned the phenomena of kanashibari already. Researchers in Japan have found that if you ask people about kanashibari specifically, they get a much higher prevalence rate than they do if they ask something more about that motor paralysis, even though it's getting at the same experience. It's also, of course, very difficult to find a representative sample of people to ask these questions to. It's very easy to recruit people that have sleep paralysis into our studies because they're inherently interested in the topic. So many times our prevalence rates are probably higher than they should be. So another question is, how scary is sleep paralysis? So we've seen from the video and all these accounts that it can be a pretty horrific experience. And indeed, that's what we find when we ask people. So this 75% refers to the number of people that say that their sleep paralysis is associated with severe or very severe fear. So it is a large majority of sleep paralysis episodes do induce a significant amount of fear. But it's not 100%. We do hear every now and again people talk about how fantastically fun their sleep paralysis is, or the real positive experiences that they have and the cool interactions they have with their demons. So it's not unheard of to have positive experiences, but the vast majority are negative. And then finally, how distressing is sleep paralysis? So by distressing, I mean how much distress do these episodes cause in your waking life? Like how much do you think about your sleep paralysis episodes during the day, and how much stress does that bring you? And around half of people who have sleep paralysis say that it does cause some degree of distress in their waking life. Not surprising, given the type of content that we've already seen can happen during the episodes. So there's been quite a lot of survey-based work that has tried to identify the full range of experiences that one might have during a sleep paralysis episode. And Alan Chaney is a Canadian psychologist who did a lot of work in this area, and what he was really interested in was trying to find all the different types of hallucinations people have and look to see which kinds of things kind of tend to co-occur together and try to identify different types of sleep paralysis, if you like, so different subtypes and clusters. And he settled in the end on there being 3 sort of distinct clusters of symptoms that people might experience. The first one is he called the intruder cluster. So the intruder hallucinations are everything about that sense of evil presence, the multi-sensory hallucination of the being in the room with you, things like that. Alongside this, you have the second cluster, which are the incubus hallucinations, so named after the demon we've already been introduced to. The incubus sets of hallucinations refer to the weight of pressure on the chest, the feeling that something is pushing you down into the bed, difficulties breathing, feeling like you're choking or suffocating. Generally speaking, the intruder and the incubus hallucinations tend to co-occur together. They have a fairly similar narrative where you basically wake up and you feel that you can't move. You then get that sense of fear, that sense of dread. That tends to maybe transform into the feeling that there's something watching you. You get that sense of presence, that evil like being just out of sight. Then from there, it can manifest into something more real, something you can see and hear. And they will eventually approach your bed slowly and then try to suffocate you, push you down into the bed. The final type, Chaney called vestibular motor hallucinations. This cluster of hallucinations tends to kind of occur separately from the 2 I've just described. This involves more like illusory feelings of movement. So the feeling that you're levitating above the bed, or even full-blown out-of-body experiences. So this is where you feel like you're rising up from your body, and then you can look down from the ceiling and kind of see your body lying there. These vestibular motor hallucinations, they tend to be the ones that are associated with the more positive experiences. People have described phenomena like astral projection, where you feel like you're kind of flying through the universe kind of thing. They tend to be more associated with the vestibular motor type hallucinations and less so with these other 2 more scary, like intruder-based hallucinations. We've also been very interested to see just what the general population believe about the causes of their sleep paralysis. When we survey people in the 21st century, we do find that most of our respondents think that sleep paralysis is due to something in the brain, or it's to do with stress. And we'll see on the next slide, actually, that stress is one of the major risk factors or one of the major predictors of having a sleep paralysis episode. But nevertheless, around 10% of people, just under, do ascribe to something supernatural being the cause of their sleep paralysis. And this number is probably lower than it actually is because, again, when we're getting people to take part in our surveys, we're probably recruiting people that are already coming in with a certain mindset about what sleep paralysis is. If we dig into those sort of supernatural explanations a little bit more, we've done a little bit of work to look to see whether there's a link between people who have reported having or believing in certain paranormal experiences and the rates of sleep paralysis that they might have. So the figure up on the right-hand side here, this is we asked participants a question: do you believe aliens have ever visited the Earth and interacted with humans? Then you've got definitely not all the way through to definitely yes. And the percentage there are the number of people that have frequent episodes of sleep paralysis. And you can see, generally speaking, that as people go more strongly towards endorsing that belief in the paranormal or supernatural claim, they tend to have a higher percentage of sleep paralysis. I've picked out the aliens question here because we've already talked about them. This generally holds true for a number of different paranormal experiences or beliefs that people may have had. So yeah, a really common question I get asked, is what causes sleep paralysis? What makes me more likely to have a sleep paralysis episode? Is it genetics? It certainly is a little bit. So we've done some work looking at particular genes that may be implicated in the likelihood of having a sleep paralysis attack. And what we've found is that genes that are involved in regulating our circadian rhythms, that's the 24-hour cycle that all of our bodies go through. It governs when we go to sleep, how long we stay asleep, that kind of thing. Particular genetic variants that make people more or less likely to have an aperiodic circadian rhythm, are more likely to fall asleep at bad times, that kind of thing. They do tend to have sleep paralysis more often. But genetics are really only a small part of the picture, and there are a huge array of different environmental factors that are going to feed into the likelihood that you may have a sleep paralysis episode on a given night. And really, the short answer to this is pretty much anything that will disrupt your sleep cycle, anything that makes falling asleep more difficult or more likely to disrupt you whilst you're asleep is probably going to make sleep paralysis more likely to occur. We know that stress predicts sleep paralysis just like it predicts pretty much everything in life. High levels of anxiety, that kind of thing. Those sorts of things that might keep you up at night, kind of ruminating distressive, intrusive thoughts as you're falling asleep. That might feed into a more disrupted sleep cycle that's going to lead to more likely that you're going to have a sleep paralysis episode. And we'll see exactly why sleep disruption causes sleep paralysis just a few minutes' time. We also know that sleep paralysis is more common in various mental health conditions. It's particularly common in people with PTSD, as we've already seen, so post-traumatic stress disorder. You see these kinds of trauma replay events happening in sleep paralysis fairly often. One thing that it doesn't seem to be related to at all is psychosis or schizophrenia. That's another common question we get asked, and actually a fairly common misconception that these kinds of hallucinatory experiences are actually psychotic episodes. There's no real evidence that that is the case. The final thing we've noted a lot in the research, and something I think is really interesting, is the fact that sleep paralysis tends to co-occur alongside a lot of other, what I would call other anomalous sleep experiences. So these are things like lucid dreaming. So this is the ability to control your dreams and sort of form stories in your dreams. Hypnagogic imagery, so that's kind of little hallucinations you get as you're kind of falling asleep, that kind of thing. All of these things tend to be co-occurring in some way. And what's most likely to be the case, is you have this kind of feedback cycle going on, where you might have some kind of stressor during the day, something that kind of upsets you, makes you in an anxious mood. That's then going to feed into then bad sleep during the night. You're going to be staying up late, ruminating, that kind of thing. That's going to make your sleep worse, and then that's going to make a sleep paralysis episode more likely. And then you get kind of stuck in this sort of negative cycle because the sleep paralysis episode itself is so scary that then you end up kind of getting more stressed out about the weird thing you experienced in the night. That's going to feed into worse sleep problems, and you end up in this kind of negative sort of feedback cycle that can be quite difficult to break. In fact, when we interview people about sleep paralysis, they often talk about it happening in these kind of waves. So you might not have any episode for a long time, and then suddenly you have a bout of sleep paralysis every night for a week, and it might be because of some kind of external trigger that's causing it. Okay, so that's kind of a lot of the psychology. So what is actually happening in the brain during sleep paralysis? So for that, we need to use the tools of neuroscience and have people come into a sleep lab like the one that we have here at the university and measure people's brain waves. So when someone comes into a sleep lab, we attach all kinds of sensors around their head. So they will measure things like their brain activity. We'll also measure their eye movements, and we'll also measure their muscle activity. And that's, of course, really important for studying sleep paralysis because we know that there's going to be paralysis. And then we can have people sleep, and we will record their brain activity in a control room. So it's really difficult to look at sleep paralysis in a lab environment. Although it's relatively common, for it to happen on any given night in a lab environment is obviously quite difficult and quite unlikely, in fact. But there have been some attempts that we'll get to. So basically what we do is after someone's been sleeping, we can get what we see here. This is called a hypnogram. And this basically tracks the type of sleep someone is in across any given night. And we go through multiple different stages of sleep, but the most important one for our purposes is this rapid eye movement stage sleep. So rapid eye movement sleep, it's a sleep stage that's associated with vivid dreaming and nightmares. We have most of our REM sleep towards the end of the night, and that's why you often get that feeling of waking up from a dream. And that's quite likely to happen because we have most of our dream sleep towards the end of the night. It's also the stage of sleep that we're most interested in from the purposes of sleep paralysis. During natural, normal, healthy REM sleep, our muscles are completely paralyzed so that we can't act out the contents of our dreams. And in fact, there's a sleep disorder called REM behavior disorder where that paralysis fails and people physically act out their dreams. So what we think is happening is that when we have a sleep paralysis episode, we're kind of waking up, but not fully, just like a little bit. Our brain is in a kind of a cross-section of rapid eye movement sleep and being awake. And so that's what has been found in the very, very few studies that have tried to look at sleep paralysis in the lab. So this is a study from 1992 where they actually tried to induce it in people in a lab environment. And they did that by having people, every time they fell asleep, the researchers would wake them up. And they'd do that over and over and over and over again until what would happen is that people would eventually fall straight into an episode of sleep paralysis. And then they can record the activity of the brain while that episode is happening. This is what sleep paralysis looks like on an EEG monitor. It doesn't look very impressive. So I'm going to show you another way of looking at this data that makes it a little bit clearer to see what's happening. Most important thing to note is this EMG line, which is the muscle activity, is like completely flat. So this person is awake, their eyes are moving, this is a blink, but they are completely paralyzed. So what this weird-looking graph is showing is quantifying neural oscillations, so patterns of brain activity whilst the person is in different stages. We haven't got to worry about what's happening everywhere here. This is what the brain looks like when we're awake. And basically what's happening is when we're awake, our brain has a natural oscillation, a natural frequency at around 10 hertz. That's what this big spike here is showing. When we're asleep, we don't have that anymore. When we're in rapid eye movement sleep, you can see that 10 hertz oscillation has gone completely and the brain is oscillating in a slightly slower state. And that kind of slowing down of brain activity is essentially what sleep is in a sense. But what's interesting in sleep paralysis is you actually find that the brain looks like a mixture of the two things. And that's what you can see here. You can see that you've got that little peak, that little waking oscillation has come back at around 10 hertz here. So what this is saying is that sleep paralysis is essentially a blend. It's like it's a mixed conscious state between rapid eye movement sleep and being awake. So that's what we know. So this was the title of the talk. We've not really talked at all yet about why people might have the hallucinations. And really at the moment we can only speculate on that. And what we can do is think about, we're looking at what parts of the brain are active and inactive during rapid eye movement sleep and seeing if that gives any indication as to why people might have the hallucinations they do during sleep paralysis. So this is a picture of the brain. Those blobs in red and blue are brain areas that are relatively overactive or underactive compared to when someone is awake but with their eyes closed and just relaxed. So there's actually quite a lot going on here. The brain is very busy during rapid eye movement sleep. It's doing a lot of things. But there's a few brain areas that are really critical to think about. The first one is this little bit highlighted down here. This is part of our limbic system called the amygdala. And the amygdala is really the threat processing center of our brain. It's active when we're detecting threat, when we're monitoring the environment for threatening events. It's involved in emotion in general. And it is very, very active, when we're in rapid eye movement sleep. And that might be why a lot of our dreams are very emotional. And obviously nightmares are very emotional too. So the fact that the amygdala is hyperactive during rapid eye movement sleep, and it's the part of the brain that's involved in processing threats, what would happen if we woke up and became conscious of our environment, but our brain is still ticking over in this rapid eye movement state with a heightened amygdala activity? So what might happen is that the brain is suddenly thinking that it's perceiving some big threat in the environment when there isn't actually one present, right? And this kind of causes a mismatch, and our brains really don't like these kinds of mismatches. So what's plausible is that some of those feelings of sensed presence, feelings of things in the room that are kind of out to get you but you can't quite see, that might be this kind of weird mismatch going on between our brain's threat processing centers kind of going haywire essentially, but in the absence of any actual real threat. Another problem, or another thing that feeds into this, is the fact that a different area of our brain called the medial prefrontal cortex is actually deactivated during rapid eye movement sleep. And this part of the brain, this is controlling a lot of our kind of higher level cognitions, our ability to reason or to sort of reappraise and regulate our emotions. So the fact that you've got our threat processing area of the brain hyperactive, but areas of the brain that are involved in regulating that emotion are deactivated, you get this really kind of toxic state of hypervigilance, really without needing to be. We can also use these brain activity maps to look at the to try and get at why people might have some of these feelings of movement, these out-of-body experiences. So the other thing to note is that despite our muscles being totally paralyzed, areas of our brain like the motor cortex and the cerebellum, these are areas that are crucial to our ability to perform actions and movement. They're also kind of paradoxically hyperactive during rapid eye movement sleep as well. This comes alongside two other important regions. I'm going to focus just on one up here. This is the temporoparietal junction. And this is part of our brain that helps to integrate our senses together, integrate our feelings of movement with our vision and our hearing and our smells and all of our senses. This area of the brain is deactivated. So you're having parts of the brain that are involved in producing movement alongside an inability to sort of understand that movement and understand where that movement's happening in the world around us. So you're getting into this situation where you might experience these illusory sensations. This is very speculative stuff, of course. I hope if I do a talk like this in another 5 or 10 years' time, we might be able to say for sure what is happening in the brain, but these are our ideas for now. So just to wrap up on something a little bit more practical, if you have sleep paralysis, what can you do about it? Well, there are sort of two main things you can do. You can either try to prevent the episode from ever happening in the first place, or you can try to disrupt an episode when it starts. So we've done a lot of surveys where we've just asked people, what do you do about your sleep paralysis, and how well does it work for you? So in terms of prevention techniques, the thing people say most often is to improve the sleep patterns. And that number there, 77%, is the perceived, how many people said they thought it worked. So about 3/4 of people think that this works. So improving sleep patterns, that pretty much means things like trying to keep a regular sleep schedule, going to bed at the same kind of day, same kind of night, sleeping for a good amount of time, waking up at the same time, getting into a good routine, basically, to try to stop those sorts of disruptions from happening. Adjusting sleeping position, we've already talked about this quite a bit. This seems to really work quite well. Trying to avoid sleeping on your back in some way. Sewing like a button or like something into your pajamas so it's uncomfortable to lie on your back seems to work quite well. And then also changes in the sleep environment. So things like trying to reduce maybe artificial lighting, unwanted noises, that kind of thing, just to try to make your bedroom more conducive to sleep. So if that doesn't work and you have sleep paralysis anyway, what can you do to break out of it when it occurs? The thing most people, the most commonly endorsed strategy here is to try to perform some kind of contextualization or rationalization of the event. We found in the past, I've had people talk to me that say that they didn't know anything about sleep paralysis at all until they read an article or went to a talk or something, and then that really actually helped them to sort of no longer fear sleep paralysis in quite the same way when they realized it had a scientific basis, there's a medical explanation for that kind of thing. This is obviously quite difficult given what I just said about how the parts of our brain that do this are deactivated during sleep paralysis. So that's probably why only about half of people kind of rate this as kind of working. Another thing people try to do is try to move a small muscle, or similarly try and make a noise. I think this has two ways that it might work. First of all, if you try to focus on just moving your little finger, like just a little bit, that's going to work to try and break that paralysis, because it seems to be as soon as the paralysis is broken, kind of everything falls away suddenly. All of the hallucinations go, like everything. You just sort of wake up and it's all kind of back to normal. It also probably helps a little bit is if you can focus on something much more specific, that might distract you from some of the other horrific things that are maybe going on. Okay. So just to wrap up, and then I think we have time for some Q&A. So what do we know about sleep paralysis like right now? So we know that it's actually pretty common in the general population, more common than a lot of people might think, and certainly more common than we thought when we first started looking at this kind of thing. We think it's this very unique state of consciousness. It's a mixture of rapid eye movement sleep kind of blending into the waking experience. You're almost in two different states of consciousness at the same time. And really, I think the thing that's eternally fascinating about sleep paralysis is the fact that we have all of these accounts throughout history. It's woven into folklores in different cultures, and it really seems to be that although the core experience remains the same, what you believe, how you interpret it, really feeds directly into what you see when you have sleep paralysis. So that's it from me, and I think we'll have some questions.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, then. We have about 10 minutes for questions. I see her hand going up immediately. I think it was you first, and then it'll be you. When you get the microphone, could you hold it as close to your lips as you can, please?
Yeah, I heard there was some kind of lie detector test where, there's another test where you attach something to your finger for your pulse, but there's something now where when they when they ask questions, they can do a brain activity scan. Have you employed the use of these brain activity scans to see what's happening, or can you see what's happening with the amygdala and different parts of your brain with these new scans?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we haven't done that much work on sleep paralysis in the lab, mainly for the reason that it's hard to recruit people who want to come to the lab and have sleep paralysis experiences. Two, measuring things like the amygdala, like you say, are quite difficult. So when we come in for normal sleep lab experiments, we just stick electrodes on people's scalps, and that pretty much means all we can do is look at what's happening at the kind of the top of the brain, if you like. The amygdala is a very deep structure in the brain. It's quite deep down, which makes it very hard to record activity from. In York, we have MRI scanning, so magnetic resonance imaging, where we can look at deeper structures. Absolutely love to do that in the future. It's just it's expensive, and it's difficult methodologically. It's difficult ethically to try and have people have sleep paralysis in a scanner. But hopefully in the future, one thing that I think would work well is recruiting participants who do have a lot of sleep paralysis and kind of scanning them over and over again. So you would have, the same experience within an individual. So watch this space for those sorts of studies in the future.
Thank you. It was that person over there, yeah?
Hi, thank you for the talk. Are there any kind of differences in demographics or mental health between the people that have sleep paralysis and find it distressing and the people that have maybe less scary experiences?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in terms of people that have more distressing episodes, definitely in people that have PTSD, you get this quite common pattern that you have this sort of trauma replay happening during sleep paralysis, which is very similar to nightmares in PTSD as well. So that group almost universally seem to have negative experiences. In terms of more positive experiences, that is a really good question. One thing we have noted in our research is that people that also report having a lot of lucid dreams tend to report more positive episodes of sleep paralysis. And one thing that might happen is people often describe you have these kinds of flip-flopping between dream and sleep paralysis and dream and sleep paralysis. So if you're able to control the content of your dreams, and then that feed that you're having a nice dream, and then you kind of wake up a little bit more, you have sleep paralysis, people are able to have more control over that too, and so can do more exciting and fun things and don't have to see intruder demons and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think having those sort of things co-occurring do seem to more often lead to a more positive experience.
Down here, please, Ella.
My wife used to say that Trevor sleeps the sleep of the dead. I don't make no noise, I don't make no movement, and sleep for me is a blink of an eye.
So you sleep very quickly?
It might be because I got very bad tinnitus.
Oh, maybe. Yeah. Could be. Yeah, so can
Pardon?
you repeat the first part again?
What she said?
Can you just repeat the first part again?
Could you repeat the first part of your question, please?
I got very bad tinnitus. I got permanent hum and whistling in my ears all the time. I can only get to sleep when I'm really tired. But I don't dream. And sleep for me is just a blink of an eye.
I mean, would definitely be good for not having sleep paralysis. I'm not sure if tinnitus has a relationship, though. I don't know.
But I did, never mind. I was having a very emotional episode of my life, thinking back my wife's illness. I was having a very emotional episode, and things started to happen in the house I didn't tell my family about. The year before last was my 81st birthday. My family came up for my birthday. They stayed in bed because it was a small terraced house. But my two daughters came to the house to make sure I'd been keeping it clean and tidy, as daughters do. So I was speaking to my youngest daughter downstairs, and my eldest daughter was upstairs. And she comes down with a very worried look in her face. "What's the matter, pet? I've just seen a lady walking across the landing into the back bedroom." I said, "Don't worry about it. She's a very nice lady."
I think it's
That's
quite
good
common
advice.
that these experiences are associated with a range of other kinds of anomalous phenomena sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you,
Tell
sir.
you what-
Can we invite questions from others in the audience?
Thanks.
Behind you, Ella. Thank you.
Hi, you were saying about most people get it when they're lying flat. So is that just because of you feel something on your chest, or is that something to do with positional? Do you move from being on your side onto your back if you're having a? How does that work?
Yeah, so generally what people describe is they kind of, as soon as they wake up and become conscious that they can't move, they're already on their back. We don't know for sure, why it seems to be so frequently the case that people experience sleep paralysis when they're on their back. One possibility is that during rapid eye movement sleep, we're totally paralyzed, which means a lot of our airways are constricted. And you have like a weight pushing down from that sense, right? So when you're on your back, that's almost amplified a little bit more than maybe when you're on your side. So it could be something to do with that. But generally, what seems to be the case is that people are waking up into this position on their back rather than they're already awake, then they turn over, and then they have sleep paralysis, which I think was your question. So, yeah.
Sorry, but I used to do functional MRI. How would you do it practically? Because it's really noisy in the MRI scanner, and certainly with functional MRI, it's even noisier. So 95 decibels. So how would you do it?
Yeah. Going back to the difficulties practically with it. When we have people come for MRI studies here, and maybe you've experienced this too in general, is that people can sometimes find it quite relaxing and often can feel a bit drowsy and falling asleep. Obviously, it's not for everyone because of the noise and everything, but we do find that especially in our student samples that people do, especially if they're doing a really boring experiment as well. There are researchers in our department, who have people look at little pictures of circles for hours and hours and hours. So people can fall asleep sort of in those environments. I think practically speaking, you'd be running up, the best situation would be that you'd have one of these like induction studies like I described, where you'd have someone fall asleep, and every time that they fall asleep, you wake them up, and then you do that repeatedly sort of over and over again whilst they're inside the scanner, and eventually essentially just hoping that someone will fall into sleep paralysis. And that's why it's so difficult to do, is because there's very little experimental control that you have over when it happens. Like I said to the gentleman over there earlier, I think one thing you could do is you could probably find people, and I've spoken to people before, who are almost like trained at sleep paralysis, like they claim they have sleep paralysis so often that they can kind of induce it themselves. In some of the ways I've done it, I've described to you, just now. So you could try to recruit those participants into your study, a little bit like how people can train to lucid dream. You can get people that can train themselves into having sleep paralysis, but it's practically very difficult, mostly because you can't control when it's going to happen. So that's always going to be the limitation.
Thank you. Time for one quick one. Did I see a hand here? Yes, please.
I was just wondering, given what you've said, whether your research shows that once people have the science explained to them of it, people who've had this as a traumatic experience, maybe linked to PS, whatever it is, that it goes away. That they think actually it's not a demon or blah blah blah, and that's the end of it. That it can be, it's not a lifetime thing. It can be cured as such by knowledge.
People have certainly told me that anecdotally. One thing we'd like to do, and hopefully we'll be starting up at some point in the future, is a study looking essentially at an educational program to try to help with sleep paralysis prevention. Right, so a little bit like you're describing. You present people with some information document, a website, something like that, where we outline all these things we're going through and see if it does actually work. On a systematic level. But anecdotally, I've heard that a lot from people that it does really help out that.
Okay, we are pretty much out of time. Thank you, Dan, and thank you for some great questions. Can we have a round of applause, please?